Hello, everyone. Welcome today to our LACIS Lunchtime lecture series. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Braga, who joined us as a native visitor scholar. Dr. Braga is currently head of the Department of Sociology at the University of Sao Paulo. He also coordinates the Center for the Study of Citizenship Rights. His work focuses on labor inequality and contemporary forms of social and political struggle in Brazil and beyond. Dr. Braga holds a PhD in social sciences from UNCAM and is widely known for his scholarship on the politics of labor, the precariat, and contemporary capitalism. We are delighted to have him with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this presentation. Thank you guys for having me over here in the center in the university that I really love because Eric Wright was teaching here. Eric was one of my great ideals in terms of professor and stuff. So it's like it's very nice to be here with you. Thanks Gay, thanks Jana. Alexandre is a former student of mine from University of São Paulo, and it's quite nice to be here. Unfortunately, I can't present my speech without reading a text. I mean, otherwise I would, lose all the details and stuff. So I'm gonna ask you guys to have some patience and follow my pace. And if I'm reading too fast, just say, oh, stop or slow down and stuff. But otherwise, I'm gonna I can't express myself in appropriate terms. So let's try it. Perfect. Thank you. Over the past 3 decades, the Brazilian labor market has undergone profound transformations that reflect the changes in the economy, in productive organization, and in labor relations. One of the most significant shifts has been the declining relative weight of the manufacturing sector, historically responsible for absorbing a large share of the urban labor force, and the consequent expansion of the service sector, particularly in commerce, logistics, telecommunications, education, health, and information technology. This transition has altered not only the occupational composition of the workforce, but also the nature of labor relations, privileging subordinate and lower skills functions, which are frequently precarious and marked by limited formal protection. At the same time, the process of productive restructuring and labor flexibilization materialize mainly through business outsourcing strategies and hiring of workers via labor intermediation firms, has redefined the centrality of unions, weakening traditional instruments of collective bargaining. This dynamic has contributed to the fragmentation of workers' collective identities, further dispersing and individualizing their class experiences. Meanwhile, new forms of employment such as platform labor, temporary and intermittent contracts, and informal jobs have expanded the heterogeneity of occupational trajectories, reinforcing the reproduction of historical inequalities related to gender, race, and social class. Such transformations have also reshaped the workers' strategies of mobilization and resistance, while the consolidation of a fragmented yet oversized service sector and the flexibilization of labor have reduced the incidence of the massive strikes once typical of the industrial sector. New, often informal, spaces of organization have emerged, articulating forms of community-based solidarity and new collective identities. Thus, the contemporary Brazilian labor market is marked by growing tensions between the precarization of the workers' reproductive conditions, the fragmentation of labor relations, the weakening of unions, and the emergence of embryonic forms of collective resistance that operate largely outside traditional labor organizing strategies. Furthermore, among the most significant transformations in the Brazilian labor market in recent decades is the contrast between two interlinked processes. On one hand, the massive incorporation of racialized workers, particularly young Black women, during the 2000s. On the other, the intensification of informalization and precarization following the unemployment crisis of the mid-2010s. In the early 21st century, economic growth and the adoption of social and educational policies, such as Bolsa Família and ProUni, expanded access for Black Brazilians both to higher education and to formal labor market. This period was marked by a relative reduction in income concentration among those who depend on earnings from labor, allowing many previously excluded workers to enter formal employment. However, the economic crisis of 2015-2016 interrupted this brief cycle of inclusive expansion, reversing many of gains achieved in the previous decade. The recession, combined with the adoption of austerity policies in 2017 labor reforms, led to a rapid expansion of informality. According to data from United Continua, produced by Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, IBGE, the informality rate in Brazil rose from 38.7% in 2016 to 44.3% in 2019, highlighting the deterioration of labor conditions. This process disproportionately affects racialized workers. In this sense, the recent cycle of the Brazilian labor market reaffirmed the centrality of racial and gender hierarchies in the reproduction of social inequalities and in defining the boundaries between protected and precarious work. Moreover, in November 2017, the dismantling of Brazil's protective labor framework entered a new phase. The labor reform was enacted under the claim that flexibilizing labor relations would promote formal job creation. However, 2 years after its implementation, the unemployment rate remained virtually unchanged, indicating that the promised effects failed to materialize. Beyond this, the reform introduced new employment modalities, such as intermittent work, that heightened the precariousness of labor relations, particularly the racialized workers who already faced substandard conditions of social reproduction. As a result, the expectations held by racialized workers regarding a potential strengthening of labor protection through formal employment dissipated amid a labor market increasingly characterized by informality, expanding precarious work arrangements, and persisting structural inequalities of gender and race. The object of this presentation is to analyze how this process unfolds through the experience of workers in two segments of the service sector, namely the call center and app-based delivery service. We understand that these two cases exemplified in a paradigmatic manner the patterns of exploitation, subordination, and precarization that have historically shaped the incorporation of racialized workers into Brazilian labor market. At the same time, they also illustrated possibilities for resistance, as demonstrated in the forms of organization and mobilization developed by this segment of the working class. Over the long period described above, it has become increasingly evident that mechanisms of exploitation and segregation adapt to the transformations in Brazilian capitalism, continually updating the reproducing racially root forms of repression within the labor market. Transformations in the Brazilian economy, especially those stemming from financialization, deindustrialization, and the widespread adoption of outsourcing, have intensified the vulnerability of the Black population, which remains disproportionately concentrated in informal, low-wage, and poorly protected occupations. This persistence reveals the historical continuity of a racialized pattern of labor insertion in which skin color remains a fundamental marker of inequality and exclusion. Thus, contemporary reading of racial and class inequalities resonates with broader interpretations of Brazilian social formation that identify the legacy of slavery as determining axis in the organization of work. Among the most influential interpreters of this historical trajectory is the sociologist Clóvis Moura. One of the foremost representatives of Black Marxism in Brazil, Moura became known for analyzing the intersection of race, class, and labor, contributing to an understanding of Brazilian capitalism as a structure intrinsically linked to the exploitation of the Black population, initially is enslaved and later rendered surplus within the labor market. He also emphasized the centrality of Black political agency from the quilombos to contemporary forms of cultural and political resistance, interpreting these expressions as political confrontations against the plantation regime and its historical afterlives. According to Moura, the formation of Brazil's racialized labor market has deep roots in the history of colonial slavery and the plantation regime developed between the 16th and 19th centuries. Brazil received approximately 46% of all Africans transported to Americas, totaling nearly 5 million enslaved workers. Through their coerced labor, they sustain the production of sugar, minerals, coffee, and other exported commodities, enabling the reproduction of expanded capital accumulation in the colonial context and establishing a structural pattern of exploitation grounded in political violence and racial oppression. For Moura, the colonial state developed systematic mechanism of repression to control the enslaved population and prevent revolts, for creating what amounted to the permanent state of civil war. Legal ordinances, malicious patrols, public executions, and corporal punishment reinforced the disciplining of Black labor while ensuring the maximization of plantation profits. Thus, class struggle shaped by enslaved people's resistance must be the starting point for understanding Brazilian society, standing in contrast to interpretations that naturalize Black subordination or celebrate a supposed racial harmony, the racial democracy ideology. Black resistance manifested itself both individually through escape, suicides, and acts of sabotage, and collectively through rebellions, strikes by free people, and the formation of quilombos, with Palmares representing the most emblematic expression of organized resistance. Moura interpreted the Quilombo experience not as a mere African survival, but as a process of becoming Black, through which the enslaved adapted customs, languages, and cultural practice to the new colonial reality, creating alternative social and political structures more efficient than the plantation regime itself. This space constitutes models of autonomy, self-sustaining economies, and collective political power that directly challenging the colonial order. The transition from slave to free labor in the 19th century did not dissolve these racial relations. The plantation elite articulated a project of whitening Brazilian society. Laws such as the land law and the Eusébio Queiroz law restrict access to property, simultaneously ending the transatlantic slave trade and promoting European immigration. Black free people were pushed into precarious and informal occupations, day laborers, street vendors, domestic workers, peddlers, and rural workers without contracts, forming a surplus population. This mass of racialized workers became a central instrument for depressing wages and disciplining the free labor market, while European immigrants were incorporated under far more favorable conditions. Moura argues that the ideology of racial democracy promoted by intellectuals such as Gilberto Freire served to mask these mechanisms of oppression. By presenting racial mixture as synonymous with equality, elites obscure the persistence of racial hierarchy and naturalize the marginalization of the Black population. Unlike in countries where segregation was explicitly institutionalized, like the United States and South Africa, for instance, Brazilian racism consolidated itself in an opaque, invisible, yet highly effective form, sustaining economic exploitation and reproducing inequality. In this context, Black resistance assumed innovative and politically significant forms. Cultural, recreational, sports, and religious associations, including terreiros and candomblé, created a practice that affirmed Afro-Brazilian identity and resist marginalization. Moura emphasized that these organizations did not simply preserve African traditions. They adapted them to local conditions of oppression, producing critical culture of resistance that combines symbolic, social, and political elements. By symbolically subverting racial hierarchies and valuing Black ancestry, these groups operated as instruments of collective empowerment and as expressions of Black political agency, mediating the relationship between race and class. In sum, Clóvis Moura's analysis reveals that racialized labor market in Brazil is the result of a long historical trajectory marked by slavery, political violence, and the construction of mechanisms of social and racial exclusion, and strategy of resistance also. The transition to free labor, far from signifying economic democratization, reorganized the labor market so as to maintain the Black population in subordinate positions while incorporating European workers into the most privileged occupations. Thus, racial oppression and class inequality mutually reinforce one another, sustaining a system of exploitation that conceals itself beneath the myth of racial equality and mestiçagem. This legacy is continuously updated through the metamorphosis of labor in the country. That is, the reproduction of class and racial inequalities shapes not only the structure of Brazilian labor market, but also the collective experience and expectations of the working class. Even during the period of economic expansion or social inclusion policies, such as in the early decades of the 21st century, the barriers imposed by racialization persist, limiting possibilities for upward mobility and reconfiguring occupational hierarchies. In the 2000s, for instance, the call center sector emerged as one of the main entry points into formal employment in Brazil, absorbing a mass of young women, mostly Black, from the urban peripheries of major metropolitan regions. In cities like São Paulo, Recife, Belo Horizonte, Salvador, etc., call centers consolidated themselves as major employers of the working class youth. These women, often the daughters and granddaughters of domestic workers, carry the historical marks of racial and social exclusion that have shaped the formation of the Brazilian working class, expressing in the present the continuity of the structures of subordination that Moura had identified in his analysis of Brazilian racial capitalism. The growth of this type of employment cannot be understood outside the neoliberal restructuring that redefined the labor market in the final decades of the 20th century. The formalization of precarious employment expressed the central contradiction of recent Brazilian capitalism. The expansion of jobs with formal contracts coexistent with the deepening of exploitation and insecurity, especially for racialized workers. The trajectory of these workers therefore embodies the historical continuity between subordinate labor, domestic work, and contemporary forms of precarious employment, in which formalization doesn't signify emancipation, but rather the reconfiguration of subordination under new languages and technologies of control. Although employment in the call center was formally regulated, ensuring basic labor rights such as an employment contract, paid leave, and year-end bonuses of 13º salário in Brazil, it rested on a regime of intensive exploitation, despotic control, and systematic surveillance. The physical layout of call centers, filled with uniform cubicles, reflected the industrial logic of productivity and repetition, while digital monitoring system reinforced control over each gesture and word of operators. Thus, contractual formalization did not eliminate precarity. It merely displaced it into a domain where the time, voice, and emotional labor of racialized women became directly commodified. This form of labor management exemplifies what Antunes has called the new service proletariat, marked by intensified exploitation under the guise of modernization. In this sense, the call center emerged as an immaterial assembly line, combining Taylorist logic with the effective capture demanded by informational capitalization. At the same time, it updated the colonial and patriarchal legacy that has long treated Black women's bodies as instruments of labor, subordinated and controlled through racialized dispositives of power. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, the creation and expansion of the call center industry were closely tied to the process of privatization and neoliberal restructuring of the Brazilian economy in the 90s. The dismantling of state-owned enterprise and the diffusion of outsourcing opened space for a new type of intermediary service, focused on customer management and digital mediation. During the Lula administrations in 2000s, this industry became a symbol of a new formal job, which increased the number of work contracts, but left intact the core of the superexploitation of racialized labor. Indeed, Black women predominantly occupy the sector's lower tier positions, those involving direct interaction with customers under the most intense conditions of monitoring and pressure, while supervisory and managerial roles with higher weights and less exposure were largely filled by white men. This divide reproduced the historically blocked pattern of racial mobility that had structured the Brazilian labor market since the post-abolition period. Daily work in call centers combined formal employment, a subjective experience of precarity, and despotic surveillance. Operators had their time meticulously counted, their breaks monitored, and even their tone of voice controlled. Software recorded every second between calls, and any deviation from the expected pattern could result in a warning or dismissal. This control is, in essence, racializing imposed upon bodies historically constructed as docile, resilient, and servile. The Black female voice becomes both a commodity and a target of discipline. It's expected to display empathy and patience, threats racially coded, while being denied decent wage and opportunities for advancement. This is a contemporary form of emotional exploitation that requires workers to transform their affectivity into productivity. Despite the precarity and the physical mental strain, call center employment was perceived by many of these women as a form of upward mobility compared to domestic work. The uniform, the ID badge, the air conditioning offices symbolized an entry into the world of real job, even if wages remain low and control suffocating. This perception of mobility, more symbolic than material, reveals the ambivalence of the Brazilian racial capitalism, a sense of achievement within a structure of subordination that remains largely unchanged. Within the broader context of Lulista hegemony during the 2000s, such ambivalence was politically mobilized, transforming formalization and access to credit into signs of inclusion, even at the cost of intensified superexploitation. In 2010s, this apparent stability began to be questioned. Increasing union mobilization among call center operators began to be started, especially in the capitals of the Southeast and Northeast regions, brought visibility to the contradictions of the model. Brazilian unionism faced in that period the challenge of incorporating precarious and racialized workers who expressed new sensibilities and repertoires of collective action. Strikes and stoppages began to denounce not only the exhausting pace and low wages, but also everyday humiliations, moral harassment, and the lack of career prospects. This was precisely the reality we observed when analyzing the relationship between call centers workers and the labor movement in the second half of 2000s. Despite their limited political experience, these workers sought support from unions to advance their labor demands. And how could it be otherwise in a sector marked by low wage, high turnover rates, widespread illness, and moral harassment? The deepening of workers' experience with the despotic labor regime of call center industry foster not only increasingly critical attitudes toward companies, but also embryonic forms of class consciousness, which were developed by unions. In São Paulo, unions such as Centratel, for instance, undertook a remarkable effort to approach the sector's workforce by mapping workers' characteristics, gender, race, age, and sexual orientation. They reconfigured their agenda, diversifying it and innovating on several fronts. The main unions in the telemarketing sector decided to participate in the organization of the São Paulo LGBT Pride Parade, mobilizing one of the event's most traditional blocks. This one in your left. In addition to participating for many years in the Pride Parade, through their organizing and unionization campaigns, Sintratel developed initiatives with the Secretariat for Human Rights of the Presidency of the Republic to curb sexual harassment in companies and combat racial discrimination. The union also took part in the World Social Forum, where it began organizing international solidarity campaigns in countries where Atento, the largest call center company in the world at that time, for sure, operates. The success of these efforts can be measured by the growing number of strikes and stoppages among call center operators in São Paulo. Practically non-existent at the sector's inception, strike movement developed to the point of standing out within national bank workers' strikes. Between 2008 and 2012, 4 national bank workers' strikes took place with effective participation from call center operators. In 2012 alone, the bank workers' strike reached a peak of 280,000 workers and lasted 10 days, to give you an idea of the size of the strikes. Black women became protagonists of new, often subtle, but politically significant forms of resistance in the call center sector, using social networks to expose abuse, forming collectives, and taking the lead in stoppages and strikes. This practice points to a process of political subjectivation rooted in daily life, marked by the combination of economic exploitation and political expropriation. Thus, in 2000s, the call center sector revealed the contemporary face of Brazilian racial capitalism, an economy that combined technological modernization, employing formalization, and the reproduction of a racial oppression. Beneath the surface of the glass towers and script dialogues pulls the historical continuity of social structure founded on the exploitation of Black and female labor. During the coronavirus pandemic, I conducted field research aimed at understanding the extent to which the combination of the employment crisis, labor reform, and the public health emergency had reconfigured the pattern of labor market insertion among young Black, poor, and peripheral workers. The investigations sought to examine how this process interacted to deepen precarization and redefine the boundaries between employment, unemployment, and underemployment in Brazil's major urban centers. The ethnographic research carried out between 2019 and 2020 in the area surrounding Avenida Paulista in São Paulo, it was the main street of São Paulo, and one of the main financial and symbolic hubs of Brazilian capitalism, demonstrated that app-mediated work had become one of the primary points to entry into the urban labor market, basically taking the place of the call center industry, and they replace the function of absorbed young workers, mainly racialized young workers. Young workers, many of whom had been expelled from formal jobs during the crisis or prevented from accessing them, found in digital platforms an alternative means of subsistence. However, this insertion occurred under conditions marked by profound insecurity, long hours, long working hours, absence of social protection, and a model of algorithmic management that fully transfer the risks of the activity onto the worker. More than a mere occupational reconfiguration, the expansion of a platform-based work expresses the radicalization of long-standing trends of labor informalization in Brazil, now draped in a rhetoric of autonomy and entrepreneurship under a hyper-technological digital umbrella. In this context, Black and peripheral youth have become, unsurprisingly, the main contingent of this new digital precarity, reproducing in updated forms the racial and class inequalities that structure Brazilian racial capitalism. Different profiles of the category across Brazil confirm that most workers in this segment are Black or brown. Many of my findings in São Paulo City can be reasonably generalized to other parts of the country. From a territorial perspective, in numerous areas of Brazilian cities, it is possible to observe the concentration of young workers, mostly Black or brown, and originating from urban peripheries, whose insertion into platforms reflects that historical continuity of the racialization of labor relations in the country. These workers clusters in strategic locations, sidewalks in front of shopping malls, public squares, areas near bars and restaurants that function as hybrid space of work, rest, and sociability. In these informal stations or pockets, micro-communities of support and cooperation emerged, where the sharing of information, meals, and advice, such as outlets and chargers, substitutes for absent institutional mediations. This precarious network of solidarity constitutes an unprotected labor community, typical of the platform era, in which work is organized outside traditional legal frameworks, but within dense circuits of economic and technological dependence. The ethnographic also reveals a curious cultural dimension. Young couriers wearing popular peripheral brands, listening to funk and rap, display the signs of a racialized peripheral identity forged along symbolic boundaries between center and periphery. Their presence in central avenues, equipped with motorcycles, bicycles, and brightly colored delivery backpacks, exposes an urban paradox. They render visible the labor force that sustains the city's consumption while remaining invisible in terms of rights, social rights, and social recognition. Labor rights and social recognition. Individual trajectories such as those of Kleber and Francisco Ficio's names illustrated continuities and ruptures of this process. Kleber, a young Black man from São Paulo's East Zone, had been dismissed from a subcontract metalworking job after returning from medical leave. Upon entering the delivery sector, he found greater flexibility and sense of autonomy in contrast to the rigidity of factory discipline. Francisco, a former Black telemarketing operator, compared the mental strain of cognitive work to the physical effort of deliveries. His valorization of the freedom from supervisors revealed the shift from a disciplinary logic to one of algorithmic self-control. Here, the rhetoric of autonomy is internalized as a subjective value, functioning as an ideological mechanism that naturalizes precarity. Cases such as those of Igor, 17 years old, and Marcelo, 16 years old, who used accounts registered to third parties because they were underaged, illustrated extreme informality and the absence of effective regulation in digital labor. Their early insertion into platform work reflects the process of Uberization, in which learning to work occurs directly within the experience of labor insecurity. This trend reinforced my diagnosis of a global precariat characterized by chronic insecurity, weakened unions, and fragmented identities. The case of Lucas, 22 years old, a young black former formal waiter, deepens this diagnosis. After the restaurant where he worked closed because the COVID, he came to depend exclusively on deliveries, perceiving in then better prospects than in formal employment. His trajectory demonstrated the shift from a Fordist ideal of stability to a new liberal idea of self-entrepreneurship, even under conditions of profound vulnerability. Taken together, these experiences indicate the app-based delivery work in contemporary Brazil constitutes a reconfiguration of long-standing racial hierarchies, now updated and operationalized by digital platforms. Presenting themselves as autonomous, workers absorb the costs of reproducing their labor power, like equipment, time, risks, while companies exempt themselves from labor responsibilities by denying any employment relationship. This constitutes a regime of accumulation based on the total externalization of risk and the naturalization of racial inequality as an organizing principle of precarity. Sociologically, the figure of app-based courier synthesizes three structural dimensions of Brazilian racial capitalism. The racialization of labor, which positions Black youth in the most vulnerable and physically exposed to jobs, political and union expropriation, intensified by deindustrialization and fragmented labor ties, and the individualization of risk and responsibility, a hallmark of capitalism, of neoliberalism, sorry. The combination of these factors produces a precarious urban working youth occupying the streets and avenues of major cities, highly visible yet profoundly insecure and legally unprotected. The app, the smartphone, the motorcycle, and the bicycle replace the punch clock and the factory uniform, but the underlying logic remains the same. Racialized exploitation has a historical axis of capitalist accumulation in Brazil. Thus, app-based delivery work not only expresses a new form of exploitation, but condenses a long history of inequality. It translates into algorithmic language the persistence of racial division of labor that spans centuries of social formation. Ultimately, these young Black workers from the urban peripheries constitute the visible link between the slave-holding past and the digital present, an essential yet disposable labor force, self-managed and monitored by algorithms, sustain the city while remaining excluded from the sphere of wage citizenship. Unsurprisingly, in many of the categories' recent protests across Brazil, workers frequently invoke the notion of modern slavery, a term also mobilized in the national campaign against the six-day work week. Despite the discourse of autonomy and economic freedom gaining significant hegemony, its limitations became evident when confronted with the harsh concrete reality faced daily on the streets under sun and rain. It did not take long for them to mobilize. The movement called Braga dos Apps marked a turning point in the struggle of delivery workers, constituting the first national mobilization of the category against the degrading living and working conditions. It demands described by participants themselves as the bare minimum include higher fees, life, death, and accident insurance, the provision of PPA, paid leave in case of COVID-19 infection, and an end to arbitrary platform account blocks. The movement articulated demands for redistribution, recognition, and dignity at work, seeking to secure minimum conditions for survival for workers who paradoxically were going hungry while delivering food. Consumer support was reflected in a drop in order volumes and lower app ratings during the strike, despite companies' attempts to downplay its impact. Even among those who did not participate directly, there was widespread support for the demands of the movement. Beyond fostering collective identities among subaltern classes and strengthening autonomous initiatives, the movement left an important organizational legacy, culminating in the creation in 2022 of the National Alliance of App-Based Delivery Workers, ANEA. Its strong public resonance made visible labor conditions that had previously been naturalized, bringing to the center of the debate workers who are omnipresent in urban space, yet socially invisible, an effect amplified by the intensive use of social media as a tool for mobilization. The intense protests in São Paulo's call center industry in the early 2010s, together with the labor unrest led by app-based delivery workers during the coronavirus pandemic, underscore the resilience of a racialized working class caught between the deepening of economic exploitation and the expansion of political expropriation. This reconfiguration represents a defining feature of Brazilian racial capitalism, the ongoing reproduction of a relative surplus population composed predominantly of Black workers. Recent publications by Diaz, an agency of research linked to unionism and stuff, reinforce this broader diagnosis. In the report called The Inclusion of Black Population in the Labor Market, 2023, this report notes that Black and brown people account for 56.7% of Brazil's population. Black women and Black men form the majority among the employment. The informal workers and the unemployed, total of 45.2% of the Black population works in informal employment. Among Black women, 45.6% work without a formal contract and without contributing to social security. Black women earn 38.9% less than non-Black women, 53.7% less than non-Black men, and 20% less than Black men. Among men, Black men earns 41.9% less than non-Black men and 23.3% less than non-Black women. This disparity extends to managerial and leadership positions, of which only 33% are held by Black women and men. Thus, as indicated earlier, while they are an overwhelming minority in higher corporate hierarchies, Black Brazilians constitute the majority of the underemployment, and are concentrated at the bottom of the wage pyramid. In 2023 report, Diaz highlights that although recent years have seen relative political stability, allowing economic activity to expand, unemployment to fall, formal employment to grow, and wages and total earnings to rise. These improved labor market conditions, however, were not sufficient to reduce racial income inequality in Brazil. Thus, even in favorable economic environments with positive labor market indicators, the impact on racialized workers is limited, failing to produce any substantial shift in the structural pattern of inequality, either within or beyond the sphere of work. An exercise based on data collected by Center for the Study and Data on Racial Inequalities, CEDRA, helps illuminate the persistence of racial oppression in Brazil. The researchers examined the evolution of income inequality between whites and black from 2012 to 2022, a decade marked by nationwide implementation of racial quotas in public universities. We can talk about a little bit more further. Period especially conducive to reduction of disparities in terms of race and income. After estimating the magnitude of this decline, they linearly projected the trend into the future as a positive trend. The result is striking. Even if the pace of reduction observed during this exceptionally favorable decade were sustained, which is, unsustained, unreliable. Income equality between blacks and whites would only be reached in the year 2396 in the context of the current climate crisis. It thus appears easier to imagine the end of the world, the end of the human race, than the end of racism in Brazil. This projection underscores the racial inequality in Brazil is not merely a residual effect of past exclusions, but a durable and structurally reproduced phenomenon. Confronting this broader landscape of persistent inequality, therefore, requires coordinated actions across multiple fronts and dimensions. As DSE emphasizes, if, I'm quoting, the inclusion of a substantial portion of Black population continues to take place under inadequate conditions, even during favorable political and economic periods, the importance of active measures to reduce racial inequalities becomes unstable. Moreover, any meaningful effort to reduce income inequality in Brazil must necessarily confront racial discrimination as a constitutive dimension of socioeconomic stratification. Conversely, policies specifically targeting the Black population will only be effective if they are articulated with broader measures aimed at reducing structural socioeconomic inequalities. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have some time for questions. Who want to start? Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is wonderful. I have comments and questions. I'm from literature and culture, so.
That's good. What is your name? Sorry.
I'm Catherine.
Catherine.
Sure. What do you say that? Well, in my class, they're reading Pagu, right? You know, in Industrial Park, which is amazing that everything you were saying, I'm like, oh my God, I was depressed for the first part of your presentation saying 1930, nothing has changed. So the structure is changing, but what happens inside that structure? We have these, you know, the fragmented identities, the vulnerable bodies, the unprotected laborers, and mostly Black women. But then you get to the end and the projection is 4 more centuries. So given this landscape and looking back to the 20th century, you mentioned moments of hope, but they seem so short-lived. And I wanted to go back to the hope because I don't know if I got the dates correctly, but I was wanting to think, well, there was just this little moment, and then afterwards, 2015, 2016. Go back to that moment of hope and what changed, and would the predictions have been different at that moment of hope than what we see now? And then my other question, just going into the cartoon that you showed about the terceirizados, I don't know if I understood it correctly. Maybe we can just unpack the cartoon, because for me, isn't terceirizados is like you go to a job agency and they give you a job, right? But are they more protected when they go to the terceirizados? I mean, don't you get the terceiro, you get the 13º mês. There's certain conditions that you get when you're terceirizado. Okay, yeah. And so but for those of maybe are not so familiar with this system, I just wanted to unpack that within this scheme. And then the rest we can talk later. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I can just try to answer and we start again. Okay, thank you, Catherine. That's great questions, and then you go straight to for the issues and stuff. Well, the second part of your question about the terceirization process is one of the I mean, most interesting stuff about the 2000 Brazilian labor market is this is spread out of the employment terceirizado, I mean, the officers' employment, which is nice on one hand because you've got formal jobs. When I studied the call center industry, I found no informal labor in that industry, which is remarkable to Brazilian standards. But on the other hand, the employment, which is terceirizado, in general, they are much more commodified because the unions that exist and act and are active in the sector of outsourced labor markets, they are very fragile, almost non-existent, and they cannot represent the workers. The labor hours are longer than the protect part of the workforce. The benefits are inexistent because the labor cannot negotiate benefits when they are signed the collective contract. And they are formed by mainly unskilled workers, which is a very tricky, situation because the unskilled worker is much more, likely to be replaced, and the turnover rates are much more higher in this sector when you compare with the other kind of workers. The terceirization condemns this very contradiction of the Brazilian labor market at that time, which is on one hand, you have formal protection labor, formal labor. On the other hand, you have very precarious labor, which earns almost nothing. To give you an idea, during the 80s and 90s, during the 70s and 80s, the labor market in Brazil specialized in produced positions which pay like 3 to 5 minimum wage in general. The engine of production of labor position was concentrated in 3 to 5. During the 90s, it shifted to change a lot because of the unemployment crisis. But during 2000, every single body here in Brazilian labor market, the Brazilian labor market created 2.2 million jobs, formal million jobs, which paid 1 minimum wage, which is very low even to Brazilian standards, because the minimum wage in Brazil is nothing. It's like the GSE, for instance, calculated that to provide dignity to the worker in Brazil, you have to pay like take into consideration the amount of money that we pay like 1 minimum wage in Brazil, you have to pay like 4-5 times a minimum wage. So 1 minimum wage is nothing, and that is the minimum wage that we have in Brazilian labor market in 2000. And now it's a little bit different, but during 2010, it became worse. Yeah, that's the point. On one hand, we have hope to, for instance, I studied the call center industry, and I interviewed lots of call center operators, mainly women. 70% of the call center operators in Brazil is formed by women, and 63% is formed by black people. So it's like I interview lots of black women, young black women. And then they said, well, I'm here, but I'm trying to, pay my pro-uni. I'm trying to pay for my high education in a private, very, very low skill, very low quality. Anyway, my private college loans, etc., and the government subsidize a loan, which make this indebtedness process more, more accessible, etc. And I'm trying to just, I mean, working here in order to pay my loan. But in the end of this process, the expectation was like, well, now I got my, degree, university degree, and to the labor market, I'm gonna, realize my dreams in terms of, earning more than 1 minimum wage, 1.5 minimum wage. But when she returned to, and she faced lots of, challenges and stuff because, it's a very harsh labor. But even so, she managed to overcome all the difficulties and, finish the job. And when she returned to the labor market, she was basically, getting jobs in the same positions because there is no other position available to a woman, a Black woman, with a very low degree, very low value degree of a, private university, which basically nobody cared about. So she re-entered, she go again to the call center industry. And these expectations became at that time a huge frustration. So that's the process. I mean, from the hope to the fear, from the hope to the frustration, from the hope to angry, from the hope to attempts to become a self-entrepreneurship oriented kind of worker, female worker and stuff. Because I mean, try to open a new job, be a self-entrepreneur. It's apparently it's better than to work in this kind of position which has no future. So that's the main point.
More questions?
Thank you very much, Professor. My name is Habib.
Habib.
Yes. I have a question because you spoke about the earnings of different people. You spoke about white people and Black people, men, and then at the bottom are the women, Black women. I don't know if considering the situation right now in Brazil and I mean political, economic, everything, even though you did project that the solution is in about 400 years, I don't know if there are any policies or policy guidelines that the government is pursuing to make sure that the situation of Black women is, in particular is sound.
Yeah, I don't want to give you a wrong idea about the current, especially the current president and government, because they're trying to do something. I mean, they have been very, sensitive with this kind of situation and trying to do something. But the Brazilian government, since from the 2000s until today, the new old Brazilian government, the Workers' Party government, they have to emphasize more or less the same strategies, which is more or less financialize the public policies. I mean, they have to spread, they are trying to spread like loans, subsidized loans in order to, to reinforce a sort of sense of, entrepreneurship among the Brazilian working class, which is right now very disorganized. Why? Because they have to pay lots of interest to the market and stuff, and Brazil is like was kept in a very tricky situation in resolving that as of the Brazilian government, the Brazilian state, the Brazilian apparatus, state apparatus. So right now, I would say that they are obviously trying to, for instance, do more or less the same they did during the 2000s. I mean, just, to amplify the strategy of indebtedness of among the working class, especially the Black population. I mean, the Black working class in Brazil. They obviously they reinforce the Bolsa Família program, which is very, I would say, racialized strategy because they privilege the Black woman among the family in order to get the money and manage the money, which is, in my opinion, which is correct. It is not a problem. They are, expanding this program, which is okay. They are, reinforcing the ProUni program, which is okay also. They are trying to organize a move or strengthen the movement against the 6-day week work, which is nice also. But in my opinion, all these actions, all these initiatives are just or can just reproduce racial inequalities. Because in a country like Brazil, I think it happens in, globally, but in a country like Brazil, only if you want only reproduce racial inequality, you have to do a lot of effort, because the natural tendency is that the inequality basically get bigger, I mean, not get lower. So only to reproduce the same inequality, the same level of inequality among the workers and the Black and women people, you have to do a lot of effort. And the government is doing a lot of effort only to reproduce. That's the reason, because we got this long period in front of us to overcome the. And I'm just talking about income equality, which means in general terms, I mean, equality in terms of being exploited by companies. It's something simple like that. I mean, it's only the level of income, which is okay, but it is not. I mean, it's necessary, but it is not sufficient to replace racism, racial oppression in Brazil. So that's the point. I mean, the government. I mean, they're trying, but like in the thousands, these attempts are not very well succeed if you are talking about overcoming inequality, racial inequality. If you are talking about just reproducing inequality, it's okay.
To run